300 vampires knelt in that ballroom, not for their king, for her. 24 hours earlier, she was a nobody, an archivist, arguing about humidity levels in a corporate library. By midnight, she was the most dangerous woman in the immortal world, and nobody in that room saw it coming. Not the guests, not the bride, not even the ancient vampire king who brought her there as a favor. A fake date, a 6-hour arrangement with an expiration clock built in. He needed a decoy, someone the immortal court couldn't touch, couldn't buy, couldn't use against him. He had no idea he was about to hand his entire kingdom to a stranger. Bloodlines govern everything in this world, but absolute power guarantees nothing when family politics are involved, and Nathaniel Croft, sovereign of the East Coast Covens, was about to learn that lesson in front of every noble house on 2 coasts. His brother's royal wedding was supposed to be a controlled, calculated evening. Instead, the woman he dragged down the aisle shattered 3 centuries of carefully buried secrets, and by the time the truth finished unraveling, the entire immortal hierarchy would answer to her. To the mortal world, Nathaniel Croft was a phantom. If you casually flipped through an issue of Forbes or the Wall Street Journal, you might catch a fleeting mention of his massive private equity firm, Croft Holdings. You wouldn't see his face. There were no candid photographs, no interviews, no charity galas with his name printed on the program. To the general public, he was merely an eccentric, reclusive billionaire who owned half of Manhattan's real estate and rarely left his sprawling, heavily fortified estate in the Hudson Valley. Analysts speculated about his health. Tabloids speculated about scandal. None of them came remotely close to the truth. Because to the immortal elite, the ancient predators draped in designer suits and dripping in inherited diamonds, Nathaniel was the undisputed king of the eastern seaboard. He was a vampire of terrifying age and incalculable power, maintaining a fragile peace among rival covens through a mixture of financial leverage and sheer brutal force. Under his rule, the covens of the East had not gone to open war in over 60 years. That peace was not born of goodwill. It was born of fear, of respect, and of the certain knowledge that Nathaniel Croft did not make idle threats. Yet for all his lethal influence, for all the empires he had built and burned across 4 centuries, Nathaniel was currently standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse study, one hand pressed flat against the cold glass, seriously contemplating the aerodynamics of throwing himself into the sun. His younger brother, Alaric, was getting married. In the mortal world, a wedding is a celebration of love. Flowers, vows, an open bar, a slightly too long toast from a drunk cousin. In the immortal realm, a royal wedding is a blood-soaked chessboard disguised in white silk and candlelight. Every guest was a variable. Every toast was a potential declaration of war. Every dance was a negotiation. Alaric was set to marry Camilla Dupont, the darling daughter of the Southern Covens. It was, on paper, a strategic alliance meant to unify the 2 halves of the country, ending decades of quiet skirmishes over territory, blood rights, and old grudges that had never fully healed since the founding families first crossed the Atlantic. On paper, it was elegant. In practice, it meant that every ancient house with a claim to relevance would be crammed into a single ballroom, watching each other, cataloging every slight, every alliance, every flicker of weakness. The guest list itself was a nightmare of delicate egos, ancient grudges, and political landmines. Nathaniel had personally reviewed it 4 times, cross-referencing it against 3 centuries of recorded feuds, unresolved blood debts, and broken treaties. He had flagged 11 potential incidents. His security team had flagged 19. Somewhere between those 2 numbers sat the actual terrifying truth. But Nathaniel's primary problem, the one keeping him awake at an hour when he should have had no reason to be conscious at all, wasn't the guest list. It was his +1. For the past 50 years, the king's side had been conspicuously empty. No consort, no companion, no name attached to his in the whispered gossip of the covens. His last major public relationship had been with Victoria Vanderwood, a ruthless, incredibly powerful vampire who treated social climbing as a blood sport and had once orchestrated the quiet financial ruin of an entire rival house simply to secure a better seat at a coronation dinner. Their breakup had leveled a city block in Chicago back in the 80s. The mortal authorities had called it a gas main explosion. The immortal authorities had called it Tuesday. Now, Victoria was using Alaric's wedding as leverage. She had spent the last several months quietly rallying the council, spreading careful, deniable rumors that she would be attending on Nathaniel's arm, that the 2 houses were reconciling, that her presence beside him would effectively signal a reunification and put her in a direct, unassailable line to be Queen of the East. It was a lie. It was also, infuriatingly, a lie that was working, because Nathaniel had done nothing publicly to deny it. And, in the immortal world, silence was so often read as confirmation. If Nathaniel arrived alone, he would look weak, vulnerable. A king without a consort at his own brother's wedding was a king inviting challenge. And there would be no shortage of ambitious young nobles willing to test that opening. Victoria would corner him publicly in front of the entire assembled aristocracy of both coasts, and there would be nothing he could do to deny the narrative without appearing rattled. If he brought a random vampire from his own court, even a trusted one, it would spark an entirely different kind of chaos. Immediate rumors of favoritism, whispered accusations of choosing a future queen without council approval, and the near-certain ignition of a quiet civil war among the nobles who had spent decades vying for his affection, his attention, or simply his money. He needed a date who was entirely outside the system. Someone completely immune to immortal politics, immune to bribery, immune to the subtle psychological pressure that vampires wielded as easily as breathing. Someone who could not be threatened into betrayal, flattered into an alliance, or manipulated into becoming a pawn on anyone's board but her own. He needed a human. But not just any human. He needed a human who possessed enough fire, enough sheer, unshakable will to survive an entire evening surrounded by apex predators without flinching, without fainting, without doing anything that would confirm to the room that she was prey. He found her exactly 3 floors below his office. Penelope Hayes was not a supermodel. She was not a socialite, not an heiress, not anyone whose photograph had ever appeared in a society column. She was a 26-year-old archivist and historical restoration specialist, hired by Croft Holdings 6 weeks earlier to catalogue a massive, newly acquired collection of 17th-century European manuscripts that had been sitting criminally neglected in a climate-controlled vault since the acquisition. When Nathaniel pushed open the heavy oak doors of the corporate library that evening, intending only to clear his head before returning to the endless spreadsheet of wedding logistics waiting on his desk, Penelope was sitting cross-legged on the floor in the center of the room, surrounded by a small fortress of archival boxes. Her dark hair was pinned up in a haphazard bun, secured, absurdly, by a mechanical pencil. She was wearing a faded, oversized Yale sweatshirt with a coffee stain on the left cuff, and her fingers, smudged with ink and centuries-old dust, were curled protectively around a crumbling piece of parchment as though she were shielding a wounded animal. Do you know how completely reckless it is to leave a first-edition Machiavelli sitting next to a functioning radiator? Penelope snapped, without looking up. She assumed, reasonably, that whoever had just walked in was one of the building's rotating cast of interns. I swear to God, if this binding cracks because someone in facilities can't read a thermostat, I am going to staple someone to the ceiling. Nathaniel leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms, watching her with the faint, detached curiosity of a man observing a creature he did not entirely recognize. He hadn't been spoken to in that tone, that particular blend of exhausted authority and zero patience for nonsense since roughly the French Revolution. "I'll have maintenance lower the temperature," Nathaniel said, his voice a low, smooth baritone that usually forced humans to their knees in sheer, helpless submission before he'd even finished the sentence. It was not a conscious effect. It simply was what his voice did, an inherited weight, a resonance that pressed on the base of the skull. Penelope finally looked up, blinking behind a pair of slightly crooked wire-rimmed glasses that had clearly been knocked askew and never properly straightened. She did not swoon. She did not tremble. She did not even blink twice. She simply frowned, the way a person frowns at an unexpected line item on an invoice. "Who are you?" "You aren't Jared from HR." "No," Nathaniel replied, stepping fully into the dim, book-lined light of the library. "I am Nathaniel Croft." For a second, silence hung heavy in the room, thick with the particular stillness of centuries-old paper and older secrets. Most employees, upon hearing that name in that room, would have scrambled immediately to their feet, would have begun stammering apologies, straightening their clothes, recalculating every word they'd said in the last 30 seconds for potential termination offenses. Penelope just let out a long, exhausted sigh. The sigh of someone who had already had a very long week and was not in the mood to be impressed by anyone, mortal or otherwise. "Great, the big boss." She set the parchment down with the exaggerated care of someone defusing a bomb, then pushed her glasses up her nose. "Look, Mr. Croft, I appreciate the exorbitant salary you're paying my department, truly, but your preservation methods are a crime against history. You have humidity fluctuations in the East Wing that are making me physically ill. I found mold spores on a Galileo letter last Tuesday." Mold on a Galileo letter. Do you understand what that means to a person like me? Nathaniel felt the corner of his mouth twitch, an unfamiliar sensation. Something dangerously close to genuine amusement. "I do not, in fact, understand what that means to a person like you. Enlighten me." "It means somewhere, right now, a 400-year-old document that survived plague, fire, 2 world wars, and a transatlantic shipping crate is being slowly murdered by your air conditioning system." Penelope stood, dusting off her jeans, and Nathaniel noted, with the clinical attention of a predator cataloging a room, that she stood a full head shorter than him and did not seem remotely bothered by the difference. "Is there something you actually need, Mr. Croft? Or are you just here to watch me have a breakdown over climate control?" "Miss Hayes," Nathaniel began, stepping closer. He moved with total silence, the particular predatory grace of something that had spent 4 centuries learning exactly how to close a distance without ever seeming to move. "I find myself in need of your services beyond your archival skills." Penelope narrowed her hazel eyes, slowly, the way a person narrows their eyes at a used car salesman. "If you're asking me to forge a historical land deed, the answer is no. I don't care how much money you have. I have opinions about provenance fraud, and they are strong. I don't need forgery," Nathaniel said, and something in his voice shifted, dropped a register, became less amused and more precise. "I need an escort." Penelope stared at him for a long moment, her expression somewhere between confusion and the specific suspicion of a woman who has fielded a great many strange propositions from wealthy men and has learned to be wary of all of them. "Excuse me? Tomorrow evening I am attending a private, highly exclusive family event at Oheka Castle," Nathaniel continued, watching her face carefully, cataloging every flicker of reaction, the way he might read a contract for hidden clauses. "The environment will be hostile. I require a companion who has no ties to my social circle, who will not be intimidated by wealth, and who will absolutely refuse to tolerate anyone's nonsense." Penelope's mouth actually fell open slightly before she caught herself. "You want me to be your fake date to a billionaire wedding?" "Yes, Mr. Croft. I haven't slept properly in 2 days. Because a Venetian manuscript is trying to disintegrate on my watch. I smell like old parchment and industrial-strength archival glue, and I have zero interest in playing Cinderella for whatever corporate stunt this is. If you accompany me, play the part of my devoted partner for 6 hours, and survive the evening without causing an international incident," Nathaniel said smoothly, watching her the way a chess player watches the board 3 moves ahead. "I will personally endow your historical society with a $50 million grant. You will have full funding, state-of-the-art climate control for every collection you touch for the rest of your career, and complete professional autonomy for the remainder of your natural life." Penelope froze. The pencil in her hair slipped, clattering onto the hardwood floor with a small, absurd clatter that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. $50 million. It was an impossible sum, the kind of number that existed in her mind only as an abstraction, something that happened to other people's institutions, museums with names attached to wealthy dead men. It was the kind of money that could save thousands of lost artifacts, fund 100 expeditions into private collections that would otherwise rot in some heir's basement, build the greatest private research library on the East Coast. It was the kind of money that meant she would never again have to write another grant proposal at 2 in the morning, never again have to watch a priceless document deteriorate, because some board of trustees decided the dehumidifier budget could wait another fiscal year. She looked at Nathaniel. He was unnervingly still, his pale eyes entirely unreadable, watching her with the patient, unhurried attention of something that had all the time in the world and knew it. There was something dangerous about him, something that set off deep, primal alarm bells somewhere in the back of her mind, an instinct older than language that whispered, "Wrong, wrong, this is wrong, run." But Penelope Hayes had spent her entire adult life falling in love with old, dangerous, half-ruined things and coaxing them carefully back from the edge of destruction. She had never once run from something simply because it frightened her. 6 hours, she clarified, her voice tight, businesslike, the voice she used when negotiating acquisition terms with reluctant private collectors. Not a minute longer. I have a deadline Thursday. 6 hours, Nathaniel promised, and I'm not wearing heels higher than 3 inches. I have bad arches. Genetic. My mother's fault. Understood. And if anyone asks, I met you at a fundraiser and we bonded over rare books. I am not pretending we fell in love at a coffee shop. I have standards. A fundraiser, Nathaniel repeated, and something that might, in a much older and much less guarded version of himself, have been called delight flickered behind his eyes. Very well, fine, Penelope said, bending to retrieve her pencil and jamming it back into her hair with more force than strictly necessary. But I want it in writing. The grant. Before tomorrow night. I've read enough 17th century contract disputes to know better than to take a rich man's word for anything. Nathaniel smiled. It was a terrifying, brilliant expression, the kind of smile that had once made emperors reconsider their wars. We have a deal, Miss Hayes. He left the library that evening feeling something he had not felt in longer than he cared to admit. Not quite hope. Something adjacent to it. Something that made the endless spreadsheet of wedding logistics waiting on his desk feel, for the first time in weeks, almost bearable. He did not yet know how completely she was about to unravel everything he thought he understood about his own bloodline. The transformation of Penelope Hayes was not left to mortal hands. The following afternoon, precisely at noon, a member of Nathaniel's household staff arrived at the library with a car waiting downstairs and a folder containing, exactly as promised, a fully executed $50 million grant agreement, notarized and irrevocable. Made out to the Historical Preservation Society, Penelope had spent 3 years fighting to keep solvent. She read it twice, checked the signature against a sample she'd pulled from a corporate filing the night before, out of sheer paranoid diligence, and then allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of stunned silence before closing the folder and getting into the car. She was ushered into a lavish, windowless suite on the top floor of the Croft building, a space that felt less like an office and more like the private chambers of someone who had never once in 400 years worried about square footage. Waiting for her was an impossibly elegant Frenchwoman, introduced only as Madame Genevieve, who did not offer a handshake and did not smile. Genevieve didn't use tape measures. She simply looked Penelope up and down with piercing violet eyes, circling her slowly, the way a jeweler examines a stone before deciding whether it is worth the cut. Fascinating, Genevieve murmured, her gaze lingering, unnervingly, on the pulse point at Penelope's throat for a fraction of a second too long. The air in the room was freezing despite the visible warmth of the afternoon sun through the tinted windows, but the Frenchwoman moved with a fluid, silent grace that made no sound at all against the marble floor. Your bone structure is completely ordinary. Your hair lacks luster. Your posture, forgive me, suggests a life spent hunched over desks. And yet, the king chose you. There is something in your blood, ma chérie. A spice. A quiet defiance. It's called caffeine and student debt, Penelope replied dryly, crossing her arms. And please don't talk about my blood. It's creepy. Genevieve chuckled, a sound like glass shattering in slow motion, delicate and faintly dangerous. "You will find, mademoiselle, that everyone in Nathaniel's world talks about blood. It would be wise to grow accustomed to it quickly, within hours." Penelope was stripped of her faded Yale sweatshirt and armored, piece by careful piece, in a bespoke gown of midnight blue silk that had clearly been constructed by hands that understood fabric the way Penelope understood parchment, as something with a history, a tension, a correct way to be handled. The dress was a masterpiece, modest enough to be elegant, but tailored so flawlessly it looked as though it had been poured over her rather than sewn. It exposed the long, delicate line of her neck and shoulders in a way that made Penelope acutely, uncomfortably aware of exactly how much bare skin she would be presenting to a room full of, as far as she still understood it, extremely wealthy and extremely intense people. A single, heavy diamond necklace was clasped around her throat, the jewel resting precisely over her collarbone, cold against her skin. "Remember," Genevieve whispered, her cold breath brushing Penelope's ear as she made a final adjustment to the gown's neckline. "Do not let them smell your fear." Penelope opened her mouth to ask exactly what that was supposed to mean. Precisely, mechanically, biologically. But Genevieve had already glided away, murmuring instructions to an assistant about hairpins, and the question died unasked, filed away in the growing pile of things Penelope had decided not to think too hard about until she absolutely had to. When Penelope finally looked in the mirror, she genuinely did not recognize herself. The exhaustion of 2 sleepless nights had been expertly painted away by hands more skilled than any makeup artist she'd ever encountered. Her dark hair cascaded in thick, loose waves down her bare shoulders. Her hazel eyes, usually squinting at fine print under bad library lighting, looked enormous, luminous, faintly dangerous, in a way she'd never seen on her own face before. She looked like she belonged on the arm of a king. She also looked, she thought privately, like exactly the kind of woman who ends up as a cautionary tale in a Gothic novel. And she decided, with the particular stubbornness that had gotten her through a PhD program and 3 brutal budget cuts, that she was not going to be anybody's cautionary tale tonight. At exactly 6 o'clock, Nathaniel arrived. When he stepped into the suite, dressed in a sharply tailored pitch-black tuxedo that fit him with the kind of precision that suggested it had been made for his exact measurements and no one else's, he stopped dead in his tracks. For a fraction of a second, the ancient king forgot, quite literally, how to breathe. An old and mostly unnecessary habit he nonetheless maintained out of some vestigial instinct toward humanity. The snarky archivist in the coffee-stained sweatshirt had vanished, replaced by a woman whose quiet, commanding elegance hit him like a physical blow, something he hadn't felt in longer than he cared to calculate. "You clean up well, Miss Hayes," Nathaniel said, masking his shock behind a practiced smirk that did not, if Penelope was reading him correctly, entirely reach his eyes. "You owe me an extra $1 million for the corset, Croft." Penelope fired back, though her breath caught slightly at the sight of him, an involuntary reaction she immediately resented. He looked like an aristocratic demon stepped straight out of a Gothic romance, all sharp lines and barely contained danger. And it was, she thought, deeply unfair that a man who was almost certainly going to get her killed also happened to look like that in a tuxedo. He didn't smile at her joke. That, more than anything else, told her something was genuinely wrong. The drive to Oheka Castle on Long Island was tense in a way that had nothing to do with traffic. Nathaniel sat in the corner of the customized Rolls-Royce, the tinted privacy glass completely separating them from the driver. His hands folded over a leather-bound journal he did not open. "There are rules for tonight," Nathaniel said, his tone shifting from corporate playboy to something much colder and heavier, the sound of a man setting down a mask he'd been wearing for her benefit. "Listen to me very carefully, Penelope. That's ominous. You will not leave my side. Not to use the restroom. Not to get a drink. Not to take a phone call. Not for any reason, regardless of how urgent it seems." "Well, clingy much?" she joked, trying and failing to ease the sudden, suffocating tension in the car. He didn't smile. "I am serious. The people at this wedding are old money. Very old. Older than the concept of money itself. In some cases, they are ruthless, and they will see you as a vulnerability, a piece on the board they can use to get to me. If anyone offers you food or drink, you decline, politely, but absolutely. If someone asks for a dance, you look to me first, and you wait for my answer before you give yours. And if a woman named Victoria Vanderwood approaches you, you do not let her touch your bare skin under any circumstances. Do you understand?" Penelope felt a genuine chill run down her spine, sharper and colder than anything the air conditioning could account for. The way he spoke wasn't just protective. It was a warning of actual, specific, physical danger, delivered with the flat, practiced clarity of a man who had given this exact briefing before and had, at some point, watched what happened when it wasn't followed. "What exactly kind of family are you from, Nathaniel?" "The kind that bites," he replied softly. And for once, Penelope could not tell if he was joking. When the Rolls-Royce finally pulled up to the sprawling palatial estate of Oheka Castle, the sheer scale of the event was staggering, even to a woman who had spent her career surrounded by the physical remnants of old European wealth. The massive, manicured lawns were illuminated by what looked like thousands of floating candles, suspended impossibly in the air with no visible wire or mechanism. The guests arriving ahead of them were breathtakingly, uncannily beautiful, moving with an eerie, synchronized grace that made the whole scene look less like a wedding and more like a very expensive, very silent ballet. There was no laughing, no loud chatter, only the low melodic hum of hushed voices and the heavy scent of expensive perfume mixing with something sharp and metallic underneath it. Copper. Penelope's stomach turned slowly to ice as she placed the smell. Nathaniel stepped out of the car first, offering his hand. The moment Penelope placed her fingers in his, she felt the temperature of his skin properly. For the first time, it was ice cold. Cold in a way that had nothing to do with the evening air. Cold in a way that made the hair on her arms stand up. As they walked up the grand stone steps and entered the main ballroom, the effect was immediate and total. The string quartet playing in the corner seemed to falter for half a beat. A stumble so small a human ear might have missed it entirely, before recovering seamlessly. Hundreds of perfectly sculpted faces turned toward the entrance in a single, unified motion that made Penelope's skin crawl. The silence that swept through the room was deafening. A held breath from 300 people at once. Penelope kept her chin high, gripping Nathaniel's arm with a firmness that betrayed nothing of the way. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. She could feel the weight of their stares pressing against her skin like physical touch. It wasn't just curiosity, it was predatory hunger. The specific, focused attention of something evaluating whether she was food. Eyes flared in the dim, candlelit room. Some brown, some blue, some a terrifying, glowing amber that had no business existing in a human eye socket. They're vampires, Penelope thought, the terrifying truth finally crashing through the last of her rational disbelief. The last stubborn piece of her mind that had been insisting, right up until this exact moment, that there had to be some other explanation. My boss is a vampire, and I am a human at an immortal buffet, standing here in a dress that cost more than my rent, waiting for someone to decide I'm dinner. Her pulse spiked, hammering frantically against her neck, and she watched, with a distant, detached kind of horror, a low collective hiss ripple through the crowd, as the sound and scent of her racing heart hit their heightened senses. Nathaniel stepped slightly in front of her, a subtle, dominant shift in posture that any predator in the room would have understood instantly. He didn't say a word, but she felt something change in the air around them. A pressure, a weight, as though the temperature of the entire room had dropped several degrees in the span of a single breath. Several guests actually took a physical step backward, lowering their eyes in a gesture that looked unmistakably like submission. The message, Penelope understood without needing it translated, was clear. She is mine. Look away. Breathe, Penelope, Nathaniel murmured, so quietly, only she could hear it. You are doing perfectly. Before either of them could take another step deeper into the ballroom, the crowd parted, smoothly, deliberately, the way water parts around a stone. Walking toward them was a woman of devastating, almost violent beauty. She wore a crimson gown that practically screamed danger against the sea of muted, elegant colors surrounding her. Her blonde hair was perfectly coiffed, not a strand out of place, and her lips were painted a blood red that matched her dress with a precision that felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. Victoria Vanderwood. Nathaniel. Darling. Victoria purred, her voice dripping with a venomous sweetness. She didn't even glance at Penelope, her attention fixed entirely, hungrily, on Nathaniel. I was beginning to think you were going to sulk in your tower all evening. You almost missed Alaric's vows. I am exactly on time, Victoria. As always, Nathaniel replied, his voice a sheet of ice, flat and utterly without warmth. Victoria finally turned her gaze to Penelope, and her eyes swept over the human with naked, undisguised contempt, the way a person might survey a stain on an otherwise pristine carpet. And who is this fleeting little thing? A snack for the after-party? She laughed. A bright, cold sound. Really, Nathaniel, bringing takeout to a royal wedding is incredibly gauche. Penelope felt her fear instantly evaporate, burned away entirely by a surge of white-hot, Brooklyn-bred indignation that she hadn't fully realized she was capable of feeling in a room full of monsters. Actually, Penelope said, her voice ringing out clear and steady in the suddenly hushed ballroom. I'm his date, and I'd appreciate it if you didn't speak about me like I'm an hors d'oeuvre. Though looking at that dress, I can see why you're so obsessed with cheap consumption. A collective gasp echoed from the surrounding nobles, a ripple of scandalized, delighted shock. No one, apparently, spoke to Victoria Vanderwood that way. and certainly not a human, in a borrowed dress, standing 3 days into an arrangement she barely understood. Nathaniel actually coughed to mask a laugh, his grip on Penelope's waist tightening in something that felt distinctly, unmistakably like pride. Victoria's eyes flashed a murderous, violent crimson. She took a single step forward, her fangs fully descending, abandoning every pretense of civility that had, until that moment, kept the evening from tipping into open violence. "You insolent little mortal, Victoria. Enough." The voice boomed across the hall, authoritative and heavy with an edge that made the chandeliers themselves seem to tremble slightly. The crowd parted once more as the father of the bride, Lord Armand Dupont, approached with slow, deliberate steps. He was a towering figure with silver hair swept back from a face carved by centuries, and an aura of absolute command that settled over the room like a second silence layered on top of the first. "There will be no bloodshed before the ceremony," Lord Dupont scolded, waving Victoria away with a dismissive flick of his hand. "It is bad luck." Victoria retreated, though her eyes stayed fixed on Penelope with a promise of unfinished business that made Penelope's skin crawl. Lord Dupont turned his attention to Nathaniel, a diplomatic smile arranging itself carefully on his face. The smile of a man who had spent centuries learning exactly how much warmth to show and exactly when. "Nathaniel, my boy, welcome. We are honored by your presence, Armand." Nathaniel nodded respectfully. "Allow me to introduce..." But Nathaniel didn't get to finish the sentence. Lord Armand Dupont's diplomatic smile vanished entirely, all at once, like a light switching off. His eyes locked onto Penelope's face, tracing with sudden, terrible intensity the slope of her cheekbones, the specific shade of her hazel eyes, and finally, the antique silver locket she had insisted on wearing beneath the diamond necklace, a family heirloom she had never once, in 26 years, taken off. The color drained completely from the ancient vampire's face. He took a stumbling step backward, the crystal goblet of dark red liquid he had been holding slipping from his suddenly trembling fingers. It shattered against the marble floor with a sharp, echoing crash, the red liquid splattering across the pristine white stone like a wound. He wasn't staring at Nathaniel's human date anymore. He was staring, Penelope understood, with a fresh wave of ice-cold dread, at a ghost. "Isolde," Lord Dupont whispered, his voice cracking with a mixture of terror and an almost reverent disbelief. The name echoing across the dead, silent ballroom like a struck bell. "But we burned you into ashes 300 years ago." Chaos did not erupt immediately. Rather, it bled into the room slowly, like a creeping frost spreading across glass. The string quartet's bows froze against their instruments mid-note. The elite, ancient guests, predators who had personally survived world wars and the fall of empires, held their collective breath in a silence so absolute that Penelope could hear her own pulse hammering in her ears. Their glowing eyes darted between Lord Armand Dupont and the human woman standing, utterly bewildered, at the vampire king's side. Penelope instinctively took a step back, her fingers flying up to the heavy, tarnished silver locket resting against her breastbone, an old, protective instinct from childhood, the way a person reaches for a talisman without quite deciding to. It was a family heirloom passed down through the women in her family for generations, back further than anyone had ever bothered or been able to trace. Experts at the Smithsonian had once requested to study it, convinced it was a lost piece of 17th-century colonial metalwork worth a modest fortune to the right collector. But her mother had fiercely, almost violently forbidden it, refusing even to explain why. "I don't know who Isolde is," Penelope said, her voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline flooding her veins. "My name is Penelope Hayes." "Lies!" Victoria Vanderwood hissed, stepping back out from the crowd, the crimson silk of her gown rustling like dry autumn leaves. "Look at her face, Armand. Look at the scent of her blood. It is a trick. Nathaniel has brought a necromancer into our sacred halls to sabotage the unification." "Silence, Victoria." Nathaniel's voice wasn't loud, but the sheer, crushing authority in his tone caused the crystal chandeliers above them to rattle violently, glass chiming against glass in a discordant, unsettling chorus. He shifted his stance, completely shielding Penelope with the width of his own body. And Penelope saw, for the first time all evening, something genuinely dangerous move behind his eyes. His usually calm, unreadable pale hue had darkened into a terrifying, abyssal black. "Armand, explain yourself. Now." The elderly Lord Dupont was still visibly shaking, an unnerving sight on a man whose composure had likely gone unbroken for centuries. He pointed a trembling, manicured finger at the locket resting against Penelope's throat. "That necklace, it bears the crest of the Habsburg occultists." He drew a long, unnecessary breath, steadying himself against the weight of a memory he had clearly hoped to carry to the true end of his existence. 300 years ago, before the American covens were ever properly established, a human woman named Isolde controlled the southern territories. She was not a vampire. She was an alchemist. She knew the chemical composition of our immortality itself, the precise mechanisms of it, in a way no outsider ever had before or has since. We thought her far too dangerous to be allowed to live. He paused, and something like genuine shame flickered across his ancient features. "We burned her at the stake in Charleston, and we wiped her lineage from the history books entirely, so thoroughly that not even the oldest among us speak her name anymore. Evidently, you missed a spot," Penelope muttered under her breath, the sheer, surreal absurdity of the situation triggering her default defense mechanism of sharp, poorly timed sarcasm. Nathaniel's mind was racing, pieces sliding into place with the terrible, satisfying click of a lock finally accepting the correct key. Suddenly, everything made a horrifying kind of sense. The reason Penelope had been entirely, inexplicably immune to his vampiric glamour back in the corporate library, when every other human he'd ever encountered had felt at least some pull toward his voice. The reason her pulse hadn't so much as fluttered when he first approached her in that room full of decaying manuscripts. The reason her blood, which he had noticed and deliberately ignored from the very first moment, carried a strange, dangerously intoxicating spice entirely distinct from the flat, familiar scent of ordinary mortal blood. She was the last living descendant of the alchemist who had, 3 centuries ago, originally charted the very bloodlines that governed his entire world. "She is a threat," Victoria shrieked, whirling to rally the murmuring, uneasy crowd of nobles around her, her voice pitched to carry to every corner of the ballroom. "By ancient law, any surviving member of the Isolde bloodline must be exterminated. Armand, this is your daughter's wedding. Will you truly allow this human abomination to ruin the peace? The crowd began, slowly, terribly, to close in. Fangs descended in the dim, flickering candlelight of Oheka Castle. The low, predatory hum that had followed Penelope and Nathaniel since their arrival shifted, all at once, into something sharper. The hunger in the room had found its focus, and it was aimed directly at her. Anyone who takes a step toward her will lose their head, Nathaniel stated. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. He did not draw a weapon. He did not have to. The air pressure in the room plummeted, suffocating, and Penelope watched, with a strange, distant clarity, as several of the nearest guests visibly struggled to draw breath, their perfectly composed faces flickering with the first real fear she'd seen since they arrived. The temperature dropped again, sharply, and the floating candles above them guttered, nearly extinguished, before steadying. Nathaniel was the sovereign of the East for a reason that had nothing to do with wealth or lineage and everything to do with exactly this, the ability to bend an entire room of ancient predators to stillness with nothing but the promise in his posture. Penelope, however, was not one to hide behind a man, immortal or otherwise. That had never been who she was. Not as a scholarship kid, fighting for a seat at a table full of legacy admissions. Not as the only woman in her graduate cohort willing to argue provenance disputes with tenured professors twice her age. And she was not about to start now, in a ballroom full of monsters, with her own family's blood apparently written into the walls of this world without her ever having known it. The archivist in her mind was already working, rapidly connecting threads that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the particular, obsessive clarity she brought to any half-buried mystery. 3 months of translating densely encrypted 17th century Latin and Occitan for a project she'd assumed was purely academic. A locket her mother had refused to discuss. A last name that meant nothing to her. And, apparently, everything to this room. "Wait," Penelope said, stepping out from behind Nathaniel despite the low, warning growl that rumbled in his throat at her movement. She ignored it, locking eyes with Armand Dupont across the wreckage of shattered crystal at his feet. "You said the Habsburg occultists. You're referring to the hidden texts of 1648, aren't you? The sealed correspondence between the Charleston covens and the Continental houses." Armand blinked, caught entirely off guard, his ancient composure cracking for the first time since Penelope had watched it shatter over her locket. "How could you possibly know about the texts of 1648? That correspondence has been sealed for 3 centuries. It exists in exactly one archive. Because I spent the last 72 hours translating them for Croft Holdings," Penelope snapped, her confidence returning to her in full force now. The particular fearlessness of someone standing on the one piece of ground they actually understood better than anyone else in the room. And if you'd actually read the primary sources instead of just burning women at the stake and calling it settled history, you'd know that Isolde didn't just understand your chemical weaknesses. She authored the original land deeds for the Southern Covens. Every one of them. In her own hand, with her own seal. The entire ballroom went deathly silent. The kind of silence that felt less like the absence of sound and more like a held breath from 300 throats at once. Penelope turned to Nathaniel, her hazel eyes blazing with a fierce, brilliant intelligence that had nothing left of the exhausted archivist who'd been complaining about humidity levels 24 hours earlier. "The manuscripts you hired me to restore. The ones you acquired from Christie's auction house last month. They aren't just historical records, Nathaniel. They're binding magical contracts. And according to the translation I literally emailed to your HR department this morning, before any of this happened, the Southern Territories were never officially ceded to the DuPont family. Not legally, not magically, not ever. Armand's face turned the color of ash. An actual, visible drain of whatever passed for color in a creature centuries removed from a living pulse. That is impossible. Is it? Penelope challenged, tapping the locket resting against her collarbone with 2 fingers, deliberately, the gesture of a scholar pointing to a footnote she knew would win the argument. According to the blood seal on those documents, the true owner of the Southern Coven is the direct descendant of the original alchemist. She let the words hang in the air for a moment, watching the devastating reality settle over the room like the frost that had bloomed across every window pane the moment Nathaniel first walked in. Which means, Lord DuPont, you don't own the South. I do. The silence that followed Penelope's declaration was so absolute you could hear the wax dripping, drop by slow drop, from the floating candles above them. Somewhere near the back of the ballroom, a champagne flute trembled and clinked faintly against a tray, the only sound in the entire cavernous hall. Victoria let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh that cracked at the edges, the laugh of someone who could feel the ground shifting beneath her and refused to acknowledge it. You expect us to believe that a mortal librarian is the rightful ruler of half the country. Armand, kill her and be done with this farce. But Armand DuPont did not attack. He did not even move toward Nathaniel or Penelope. Instead, slowly, with a terrible, creaking dignity, he sank to his knees, his ancient bones audibly cracking in the quiet hall, a sound like old timber settling in a storm. Vampiric law, Penelope was quickly, brutally learning, was absolute in a way mortal law had never had the luxury of being. The magical contracts forged in the 17th century were bound by a blood magic no immortal, regardless of age or power, could simply choose to break. If Penelope held the true deed, and her bloodline confirmed, beyond any argument, that she did, then defying her would mean defying the very magic that kept every creature in this room alive and immortal in the first place. It was not a matter of politics or preference. It was a matter of physics, as immutable to them as gravity. "My lady," Armand whispered, bowing his silver head low, all the way to the marble floor, in total, complete submission. A collective gasp echoed through the room as the rest of the Southern nobles, witnessing their leaders surrender, slowly, one by one, fell to their knees as well. A wave of movement rippling outward from the center of the ballroom like a stone dropped into still water. Hundreds of apex predators, creatures who had personally outlived kingdoms, were kneeling before a 26-year-old archivist in a borrowed dress and a stolen diamond necklace, and Penelope, standing at the center of it all, felt the full, dizzying weight of a reality she had not asked for and did not fully understand settle onto her shoulders. Victoria was hyperventilating, an oddly human gesture for a creature that technically no longer required breath, her eyes darting frantically around the kneeling crowd, searching, uselessly, for some ally who had not already bent the knee. Her grand plan to corner Nathaniel publicly, to force his hand in front of the entire assembled aristocracy, had backfired so spectacularly that she could feel, with rising, panicked clarity, the last of her political capital evaporating in real time. "Stand up, all of you!" Victoria's voice cracked with fury. She is a weak, fragile human. I will not bow to a mortal. Victoria lunged. She moved with blinding, supernatural speed, her clawed hands aiming directly for Penelope's exposed throat, the diamond necklace glittering for a fraction of a second, like a target. Penelope had time to register only a blur of red silk and pale skin before she never made it. Nathaniel intercepted her with a sickening crack that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. He didn't just block her attack. He seized Victoria by the throat mid-lunge, hoisting her fully into the air with one hand. The terrifying, unrestrained power of the East Coast King finally, fully unleashed after decades of careful, deliberate restraint. The marble floor beneath his custom dress shoes actually fractured from the sheer force of his movement, a spiderweb of cracks radiating outward beneath his feet. "I warned you, Victoria," Nathaniel said, his voice dropping to a demonic, vibrating register that shook the ancient castle walls themselves, rattling the chandeliers, sending a fine dust of old plaster drifting down from the ceiling. "You do not touch what is mine." With a single, contemptuous flick of his wrist, he threw her across the room. Victoria crashed through a massive antique mahogany table laden with wedding gifts, splintering it into 1,000 glittering pieces, silver and crystal, scattering across the marble in a wide, ruinous arc. She lay groaning amid the wreckage, her pride and her power utterly, publicly shattered in front of every noble house of the immortal East and South combined. Nathaniel turned his back on her without a second glance, adjusting his cuffs with a terrifying calm that felt, somehow, more frightening than the violence itself. He looked down at the still kneeling Lord Dupont, his expression unreadable. "The wedding will proceed as planned," Nathaniel declared, his voice once again carrying the smooth, effortless authority of a man discussing dinner reservations rather than the political restructuring of an entire continent's worth of covens. "Alaric will marry Camilla, uniting our houses as intended. However, the terms of the treaty have changed. The southern covens will no longer report to you, Armand. They will report to Penelope, and by extension, as she is under my protection, the East and the South are now entirely unified under one absolute rule." He turned to Penelope, offering his arm. His pale eyes had returned to their normal, striking hue, but they were filled with a profound, undeniable heat that had nothing to do with the violence he just committed, and everything to do with the woman standing beside him. "Shall we find our seats, Miss Hayes? We have a wedding to attend." Penelope looked at his outstretched hand. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, not from fear anymore, but from the electric, dizzying realization of exactly what had just happened, of exactly how completely her life had rearranged itself in the space of about 4 minutes. She hadn't just survived a room full of vampires. She had, apparently, without ever intending to, conquered them. And the terrifying, beautiful king standing before her wasn't looking at her as a pawn anymore, or even as a convenient +1 hired for 6 hours of political cover. He was looking at her as his equal. She placed her hand in his. "You know, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice somehow steady despite everything, "I think my consulting fee just went up." Nathaniel smiled, a genuine, breathtaking expression that reached, for the first time all evening, all the way to his eyes. "I will gladly pay whatever you ask, Penelope." They walked together through the parting crowd of kneeling nobles, past the wreckage of the shattered table and the groaning, humiliated form of Victoria Vanderwood, and took their seats at the front of the ballroom as though nothing at all unusual had just occurred. Around them, slowly, hesitantly, the assembled guests began to rise, brushing off the knees of gowns and tuxedos, exchanging glances that mixed fear, awe, and the fast recalculating ambition of creatures who had just watched the entire balance of immortal power shift in real time and were already, quietly, wondering how best to position themselves in the new order. The string quartet, after a long, uncertain pause, resumed playing. Though the melody felt subtly different now, more careful, as though even the musicians understood that the room they were performing in had irrevocably changed. Camilla Dupont, the bride, emerged from a side chamber, precisely on schedule, entirely unaware of the political earthquake that had just rippled through her own wedding while she'd been having her veil adjusted 2 rooms away. She was radiant in a gown of pale ivory silk, her dark hair swept up beneath a delicate diamond tiara. And if she noticed the shattered table, the faint cracks still visible in the marble floor, or the unusually charged atmosphere hanging over the assembled guests, she gave no outward sign of it. Alaric, waiting for her at the altar with the particular nervous joy of a groom who had spent decades assuming this day would never arrive, seemed similarly, blessedly oblivious. Penelope watched the ceremony unfold beside Nathaniel, her hand still resting in his, and found herself, unexpectedly, genuinely moved by it. Whatever else this world was, whatever violence and ancient cruelty lived beneath its glittering surface, the vows exchanged between Alaric and Camilla carried a sincerity that cut through all of it, a small, stubborn thread of something like real love, woven into the center of all this political machinery. They actually care for each other, Penelope murmured quietly, leaning slightly toward Nathaniel. I wasn't expecting that. Neither was I. The first time I met Camilla, Nathaniel admitted, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. Alaric fell for her 3 years before either family agreed to the match. He spent most of that time terrified the alliance would fall through and he would lose her to some more politically convenient arrangement. I've never seen my brother so thoroughly undone by anything. That's almost sweet, Croft. Do not let it get around, Nathaniel said dryly. I have a reputation. Penelope allowed herself a small, genuine laugh. The first one all evening that didn't feel like armor. When the vows concluded and the assembled guests rose in polite, restrained applause, the reception shifted seamlessly into the enormous adjoining hall, a space Penelope hadn't even glimpsed on their way in, illuminated by hundreds more of the strange, wireless floating candles and centered around a dance floor of dark, polished stone. Long tables draped in white linen stretched along both walls, laden with food Penelope suspected, correctly, that she would not be sampling, and crystal decanters of something dark red, that she was very deliberately not going to think too hard about. Word of what had happened in the main ballroom had clearly traveled faster than the guests themselves. As Nathaniel led her through the crowd toward their assigned table near the front, near enough to the head table to make the political statement Nathaniel had apparently intended from the outset, Penelope felt the shift in how the room regarded her almost immediately. The naked, predatory hunger of earlier had transformed into something closer to wary, calculating reverence. Nobles who had, an hour earlier, looked at her the way one might eye an unattended snack tray now inclined their heads slightly as she passed, murmuring polite, careful greetings that Penelope suspected were being weighed for maximum diplomatic safety before they ever left anyone's mouth. An elderly vampire with silver hair, and kind, if slightly terrified, eyes approached their table shortly after they sat down, offering Penelope a small, formal bow. "Lady Hayes," he said, and Penelope startled slightly at the title, unused to hearing it attached to her own name. "Forgive the intrusion. I am Edmund Castelaine, formerly of the Western Territories. I merely wished to say, on behalf of my house, that we have long believed the old law regarding the Isolde bloodline to be a grave and unjust wrong. It is an honor to see it finally set right." "Thank you, Mr. Castelaine," Penelope said carefully, unsure of the correct protocol but reasonably confident that basic courtesy translated across most species. "I appreciate that." He bowed again, deeper this time, and retreated back into the crowd. And Penelope caught Nathaniel watching her with an expression she couldn't quite place. Something between amusement and quiet, careful pride. "You're a natural at this," Nathaniel murmured once Castelaine was out of earshot. "I catalogue rare books for a living, Nathaniel. I am extremely good at being polite to people I don't fully trust, while I figure out what they actually want. An underrated skill in my world," he said. "Most of my court never bothers to learn it. They simply assume fear will suffice." "Fear gets you obedience," Penelope said, watching the room over the rim of the water glass. A nervous, hovering waiter had just filled for her, unprompted, the moment she'd sat down. "It doesn't get you loyalty. There's a difference, and from what I've seen in the last hour, I don't think very many people in this room understand it." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his pale eyes. "No," he said finally, quietly, almost to himself. "I don't believe they do." Across the room, near the wreckage that had not yet been fully cleared from the main ballroom, Penelope caught sight of Victoria Vanderwood being helped to her feet by two attendants, her crimson gown torn at the shoulder, her perfectly styled hair now disheveled and half fallen from its pins. Even from this distance, Penelope could feel the venomous heat of Victoria's glare fixed directly on her, unblinking, unmoved by the humiliation of the last hour. "She's not going to let this go," Penelope said quietly, nodding almost imperceptibly toward Victoria. "No," Nathaniel agreed, his voice hardening slightly. "She won't. Victoria has spent 5 decades building toward tonight, toward exactly the outcome she believed was owed to her. Watching it collapse in front of the entire assembled aristocracy of 2 coasts is not an insult she will simply absorb and move past. Should I be worried?" Nathaniel turned to look at her directly, and for a moment the careful, controlled diplomat fell away entirely, replaced by something rawer, more protective. "You should know," he said, "that as of tonight, you are no longer simply my date, or even simply a woman under my protection. You are, by every law this world recognizes, the rightful sovereign of an entire coven. That comes with genuine danger, Penelope. Danger that will not end when this reception does. But it also means you are no longer without power of your own. Victoria cannot touch you without inviting a war she cannot possibly win. Not against you, not against me." Penelope absorbed this in silence for a moment, watching the flickering candlelight catch on the crystal decanters, on the diamond around her own throat, on the sea of ancient, watchful faces surrounding her on every side. "This is a lot," she admitted finally, quietly, some of the composure she'd maintained since the ballroom finally cracking, just slightly, at the edges. 24 hours ago, I was arguing with a facilities manager about humidity control. Now, apparently, I own half a continent's worth of vampires. I am aware this was not the evening you signed up for, Nathaniel said, and something in his voice, some genuine, unguarded softness, made Penelope look up at him properly. You are permitted to be overwhelmed, Penelope. I would think considerably less of you if you weren't. Is that your way of checking if I'm okay, Croft? It is my way of telling you that whatever happens next, you will not be facing it alone. He held her gaze steadily, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all, the noise of the reception fading, briefly, into something distant and unimportant. I made you a promise in that library. 6 hours, and a grant, and nothing more. I intend to honor it in full, but I would be lying, Penelope Hayes, if I told you I have any intention of this ending when the 6 hours do. Penelope felt her pulse quicken, and this time it had nothing at all to do with fear. The reception wore on, and Penelope found herself, against every expectation she'd carried into that ballroom, settling into something almost resembling ease. Not comfort. Exactly. Comfort felt like the wrong word. For an evening spent surrounded by creatures who could, in theory, drain her dry before she finished her water. But a kind of practiced steadiness, the same muscle she'd built over years of defending her department's budget in front of hostile boards, of holding her ground in rooms full of people who assumed, wrongly, that her youth meant her opinions carried less weight. A young vampire woman, introduced to her only as Seraphine, daughter of one of the Western houses, approached midway through the second course. With a plate of fruit, she offered almost shyly, as though testing whether the gesture would be accepted. I understand you cannot eat the rest of it, Seraphine said, setting the plate down carefully in front of Penelope. But the fruit is safe. I thought you might be hungry. Penelope blinked, genuinely touched by the small, unexpected kindness. Thank you. That's very thoughtful. My grandmother used to speak of Isolde, Seraphine continued, lowering her voice slightly, glancing once toward the head table where Armand still sat, visibly subdued, before continuing. Not in the histories, of course. Those were rewritten generations ago. But in the old stories, the ones told to children at night, she was not remembered as a villain in every house, Lady Hayes. In mine, she was remembered as a woman who tried to warn the Covens what their own hunger would eventually cost them, and was destroyed for it. Penelope felt something tighten in her chest, an unexpected grief for a woman 3 centuries dead, whom she'd never known existed until an hour ago. What was she trying to warn them about? Seraphine hesitated, glancing again toward Armand, and something in her expression suggested this was not a conversation meant for open ballroom air. Perhaps another time, my lady. There are ears here older than mine, and longer memories attached to them. She retreated before Penelope could press further, leaving Penelope turning the fragment over in her mind, filing it away alongside the growing list of things about this world she suddenly, urgently needed to understand. Nathaniel, watching the exchange from beside her, leaned in slightly. You've already made an ally. That took most nobles decades to accomplish in my court. I gave her a compliment about fruit, Nathaniel. Let's not overstate my diplomatic genius. You'd be surprised how rarely genuine kindness is offered in this room, he said. Most of what passes for courtesy here is calculation dressed in silk. She wasn't calculating anything. She was simply being kind to you. That is not nothing. Across the hall, Penelope noticed Camilla, still glowing in her wedding gown, slip away from a cluster of well-wishers and make her way with the particular determined grace of a bride who had spent months planning exactly when she'd finally get 5 minutes to herself toward the terrace doors at the edge of the room. On impulse and against every instinct telling her to stay glued to Nathaniel's side as instructed, Penelope touched his arm. "I'll be right back." Nathaniel's expression sharpened immediately. "Penelope, she's the bride, Nathaniel. I think even Victoria draws the line at murdering me in front of Camilla on her own wedding night. I'll stay in view, I promise." He studied her for a long moment, some internal calculation playing out behind his eyes, before giving a single, reluctant nod. "The terrace. Nowhere else. And if anyone approaches you who is not her, you call for me. I will hear you." Penelope made her way to the terrace, where Camilla stood alone at the stone balustrade, looking out over the dark, sprawling gardens, with an expression that mixed exhaustion and genuine joy in equal measure. "I hope I'm not intruding," Penelope said. "I can go back inside." Camilla turned, and for a moment, surprise flickered across her face before settling into something warmer. "You're the one who told off Victoria Vanderwood in front of the entire Southern aristocracy. Please, stay. It's the best thing that's happened at this wedding besides the actual wedding part." Penelope laughed despite herself, moving to lean against the balustrade, a respectful distance away. "I didn't exactly plan on causing an international incident tonight. Most people who cause them don't," Camilla said, a small, knowing smile playing at her lips. "I've been watching this world reorganize itself around you for the last 2 hours, and I have to say, it's the most interesting thing to happen at a coven wedding in about a century. Everyone usually just gets drunk on very expensive blood wine and complains about each other behind fans. Can I ask you something?" Penelope said. "And you can absolutely tell me it's none of my business. Go ahead. Do you actually love him, Alaric?" Camilla's expression softened entirely, all the careful, practiced diplomacy of the evening falling away. "More than I have loved anything in 4 decades of existence," she said simply. "Our families needed this marriage for their own reasons. I would have said yes regardless, but I would have found a way to make sure it was him specifically, family politics or not. I made that clear to my father a long time ago. That's not the answer I expected from an arranged royal wedding. Nothing about this world is what outsiders expect," Camilla said, looking back out over the gardens. "Least of all Nathaniel. Do you know how long I've known him? I couldn't begin to guess. Since before I could count centuries properly. He practically raised Alaric after their parents were killed in a coven war generations before I was born. He has spent nearly the entirety of my brother-in-law's memory being the coldest, most controlled creature in any room he enters, because he learned very young that the moment a king shows softness, someone tries to exploit it." Camilla turned to look at Penelope directly, something searching in her gaze. "I have never once, in 40 years, seen him look at anyone the way he looked at you when Armand was screaming about ghosts and lost bloodlines. Not once." Penelope didn't know how to answer that, so she said nothing at all, watching the candlelight flicker against the dark garden hedges instead. "Be careful with him," Camilla said finally. "Not unkindly. Not because he'll hurt you. He won't. But because if you break that particular kind of ice, Penelope Hayes, there is no version of this where it simply refreezes. He does not do anything by half measures. Least of all this. Before Penelope could respond, the terrace doors opened behind them, and Nathaniel appeared, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes finding Penelope immediately, scanning her, cataloguing her safety in a single practiced sweep. "Forgive the interruption," he said. "I promised to keep watch, and my patience for distance has apparently expired early." Camilla laughed, straightening from the balustrade. "I was just leaving anyway. Alaric will start a diplomatic incident of his own if I abandon him at his own reception much longer." She turned to Penelope, offering a small, genuine smile. "It was truly a pleasure, Lady Hayes. I hope we speak again soon." Under considerably calmer circumstances, she swept back inside, leaving Nathaniel and Penelope alone on the moonlit terrace, the muffled sound of the reception continuing behind the closed doors. "You were listening," Penelope said, not quite a question. "I was watching," Nathaniel corrected. The listening was somewhat unavoidable, given the acoustics of stone architecture and my particular hearing. "So you heard all of it." "I heard enough of it," he said, moving to stand beside her at the balustrade, close enough that she could feel the cold radiating faintly from his skin, even through the evening air. "Camilla is not wrong, for what it's worth, about any of it." Penelope looked at him properly then, at the sharp, aristocratic lines of his face, softened, just slightly, by moonlight, and something more vulnerable than the careful mask he'd worn all evening. "Which part specifically?" "All of it," he said again, quieter this time. "I have spent 4 centuries perfecting the art of feeling very little, Penelope. It is, I promise you, considerably easier than the alternative. And now I find myself standing on a terrace at my brother's wedding, having just publicly reordered the entire political structure of 2 coasts, and the only thing I can think about is whether you're cold." A small, self-deprecating smile touched his mouth. "It is, I confess, an unfamiliar and somewhat inconvenient set of priorities." Penelope felt warmth rise in her chest, despite the cool night air, despite everything impossible about this entire evening. "I'm fine, Croft. Try to contain your existential crisis." "I shall endeavor to," he said dryly. And for a moment, standing there in the moonlight with the noise of the reception muffled behind them, it was almost possible to forget that somewhere inside, Victoria Vanderwood was nursing a wound to her pride that Penelope suspected would not stay quiet for long. She did not have to wonder for very long. They returned inside a few minutes later, and the remainder of the reception passed with the particular, brittle politeness of a room still recalibrating itself around a new and uncertain order. Toasts were given. Alaric, visibly and touchingly overwhelmed, thanked his brother for reasons the mortal guests present, had there been any, would never have understood, referencing sacrifices and protections that Penelope suspected went considerably deeper than typical wedding toast material. Camilla's father delivered a long, formal speech about unity between the coasts that Penelope now understood was being delivered, at least in part, directly to her, a careful, diplomatic acknowledgement of the new reality without ever quite naming it outright. It was nearing midnight as the orchestra shifted into something slower and the dance floor began to fill, that Penelope noticed Victoria slip out of the ballroom through a side entrance, no longer flanked by attendants, moving with the quick, controlled purpose of someone who had finished licking her wounds and was now planning something considerably less passive. "She left," Penelope murmured to Nathaniel. nodding subtly toward the side entrance. Nathaniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I noticed. Should we be worried? Victoria does not simply retreat, Penelope. She regroups. He turned to face her fully. Something calculating settling behind his eyes, the diplomat receding, the strategist emerging. I do not believe she will act tonight, not in a house this heavily guarded and this politically exposed. But she will not accept tonight's outcome quietly, and I would be a fool to assume otherwise. Comforting. I did warn you this came with genuine danger. You did, Penelope agreed. You didn't mention it would come with quite this much period drama, though. I feel like I've fallen into one of the manuscripts I'm supposed to be cataloging. Nathaniel's mouth curved, despite the tension still visible in his shoulders. If it is any consolation, Miss Hayes, I have lived through a great many manuscripts worth of period drama, and this evening ranks among the more memorable. The reception wound down slowly after that. Guests departing in staggered waves with the particular reluctance of an aristocracy that clearly relished any excuse to linger and gossip. Armand approached once more before their own departure, considerably more composed than he had been in the ballroom, though still carrying the visible weight of a man whose entire understanding of his own family's legacy had been upended in a single evening. Lady Hayes, he said, bowing formally, I owe you, and the memory of your ancestor, a debt I cannot properly repay tonight. I would ask, when circumstances allow, for the opportunity to discuss the Southern Coven's transition with you directly, properly, not amid chaos and shattered crystal. I'd like that, Penelope said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it. I have about 400 years of questions, Lord Dupont. You might regret the offer. A faint, weary smile touched the old vampire's face. I suspect I owe your bloodline considerably more patience than 400 years of questions could ever cost me. He retreated, and Nathaniel guided Penelope toward the grand entrance. His hand settled at the small of her back, the Rolls-Royce already waiting at the base of the stone steps, exactly as it had been hours earlier, though it felt, to Penelope, as though an entire lifetime had passed inside that ballroom, rather than a single evening. The drive back into the city was quiet, comfortable in a way the drive out had not been. The tension of the earlier briefing replaced by something softer, more contemplative. Penelope watched the dark countryside slide past the tinted windows, her mind still turning over everything that had happened, the locket at her throat suddenly heavier with meaning than it had ever been in 26 years of simply wearing it without question. My mother knew, she said quietly, mostly to herself. She had to have known. Why she wouldn't let anyone study it. Why she never talked about her side of the family. She must have known exactly what this was. Perhaps, Nathaniel said gently. Or perhaps she knew only enough to be afraid of it, without ever fully understanding why. Fear passed down through generations rarely survives, with its original reasoning intact. Only its weight does. I need to call her, Penelope said, a note of sudden urgency entering her voice. Tomorrow. I need to ask her everything. Of course, Nathaniel said. Whatever you need. He was quiet for a long moment, watching her in the dim light of the car, before he spoke again, his voice carrying a weight that suggested he had been debating whether to raise the subject at all. There is something else you should know about Isolde, he said finally. Something Armand did not say tonight, either because he does not know it himself, or because 3 centuries of guilt have made certain truths easier to leave buried. Penelope turned to him fully, every instinct she'd honed across years of archival work sharpening at once. "What do you mean?" "I did not live through the burning," Nathaniel said. "I was already sovereign of the East by then. But the southern territories were not yet mine to protect, and I was engaged in my own wars, a continent away. What I know from records my own house kept at the time. Correspondence between covens that Armand's family would very much prefer had been destroyed generations ago." "Tell me." Nathaniel studied her for a moment, as though weighing how much truth she was prepared to carry on top of everything else this night had already asked of her. And then, apparently deciding she had more than earned it, began. "Isolde was not simply an alchemist who happened to understand our biology," he said. "She had spent nearly a decade before her death attempting to warn the Southern Covens that the way they fed, the sheer, unchecked scale of it, was drawing dangerous attention from the mortal authorities of the era. Entire villages had begun disappearing along the Carolina coast. Isolde believed, correctly as it turned out, that continued unchecked feeding would eventually provoke exactly the kind of coordinated mortal retaliation that very nearly ended our kind twice before in recorded history. She proposed reforms, rationing, formal accords with human settlements, arrangements not unlike the ones I maintain with certain mortal institutions today. They killed her for trying to make things safer," Penelope said slowly, the horror of it settling into her chest like a stone. "They killed her because young, ambitious covens do not enjoy being told their appetites will eventually destroy them. Particularly not by a mortal woman with no fangs of her own to back the warning," Nathaniel said, his voice hardening with an old, inherited anger that clearly predated his own personal involvement in any of it. It was easier to call her a threat, to frame her knowledge of our biology as a weapon rather than a warning, and burn the entire uncomfortable truth along with her. Penelope sat with that in silence for a long moment, watching the dark countryside blur past the window, the weight of an ancestor she'd never known, settling over her with a clarity that felt almost physical. She was right, though, wasn't she? About the danger. She was entirely right. Nathaniel confirmed quietly. It took the Covens nearly another century after her death to adopt reforms almost identical to the ones she had proposed, and only after 2 further near-catastrophic exposures to mortal authorities forced the issue. "Every accord my court currently maintains with human institutions, every careful arrangement that keeps my world hidden and yours safe from the worst of what creatures like Dominic Mercer or the old Southern houses once did without consequence, traces its intellectual lineage directly back to a woman who was burned alive for suggesting it 300 years too early. No wonder Seraphine's grandmother remembered her as something other than a villain. The old stories rarely lie as cleanly as the official histories do," Nathaniel said. "They simply lack the political motive to bother." Penelope pressed her fingers against the cold silver of the locket at her throat, feeling it differently now. No longer simply an inherited curiosity her mother had refused to discuss, but a physical thread connecting her directly to a woman who had tried, at genuine and ultimately fatal cost, to protect a world that had repaid her with fire. "I want to finish what she started," Penelope said, the resolve in her voice unmistakable. "Not just catalogue the history, actually understand it. If there are reforms still needed, accords still worth strengthening, I want to know. Nathaniel's expression, when she looked up at him, held something that looked remarkably like reverence. I suspected, the moment Armand said her name, that you would say exactly that. Penelope called her mother the following afternoon. Sitting alone in the guest suite Nathaniel had insisted she use rather than return to her own apartment, while the household's security team completed what he'd described, with characteristic understatement, as a few necessary adjustments to her personal safety arrangements. Her hands were not quite steady as she dialed, the locket still resting against her collarbone where it had sat, undisturbed, for 26 years. "Sweetheart," her mother answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the familiar, warm distraction of a woman gardening with the phone tucked against her shoulder. "How was the work trip? You said something about cataloging for a big client." "Mom," Penelope said, and something in her tone must have carried more weight than she intended, because she heard the sound of trowel against soil stop abruptly on the other end of the line. "Penelope, what's wrong?" "I need you to tell me about the locket," Penelope said. "The real story. Not the version where you just say it's a family heirloom and change the subject. I need the actual truth, Mom, and I need it now." There was a long silence on the line, long enough that Penelope wondered if the call had dropped, before her mother spoke again, her voice noticeably smaller than it had been a moment earlier. "Where are you right now?" "Somewhere safe, I promise. But I met someone last night, Mom. Someone connected to that locket in a way I don't fully understand yet, and I need you to help me understand it." Another long pause. When her mother finally spoke again, there was an old, careful weariness in her voice, the sound of someone setting down a burden she'd been quietly carrying for decades. "My grandmother told me, when I was about your age, that the women in our family carried something old in our blood, something that made certain kinds of people take a very particular interest in us, whether we wanted it or not. She never explained it fully. I don't think she entirely understood it herself. Honestly, just that it had been passed down as a warning, generation to generation, since before anyone could properly trace it. Never take the locket off. Never let anyone study it closely. Never, under any circumstances, discuss it with strangers who ask too many questions about our family history." Her mother let out a long, unsteady breath. "I always assumed it was superstition, old family paranoia that had outlived whatever original reason it had. I am beginning to suspect, from the tone of your voice, that I was wrong about that." "You weren't entirely wrong to be careful," Penelope said gently. "You just didn't have the whole story. I don't think anyone in our family has had it for 300 years. Penelope, you're scaring me." "I know, I'm sorry. I promise I'll explain everything, properly, in person, as soon as I can. But I need you to know that whatever you were protecting by keeping that locket close and quiet all these years, you did the right thing. You kept something important, safe, without even knowing exactly what it was. That matters more than you understand right now." Her mother was quiet for a long moment. "Is this about your father's side or mine?" "Yours," Penelope said. "All the way back, further than you'd think. Are you safe?" Penelope glanced toward the closed door of the guest suite, beyond which she could hear the low, distant murmur of Nathaniel's security team conducting their assessment of the estate's perimeter, a level of careful, deliberate protection she was still adjusting to. "I am," she said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it completely. "I'm safer right now than I think I've ever been, actually. It's a long story." "You've always liked long stories," her mother said. a note of fond, exasperated affection creeping back into her voice despite everything. "Come home soon, sweetheart. Bring the long story with you. I think, after 30 years of not knowing what I was actually guarding, I've earned the right to finally hear it." "I will," Penelope promised. "I love you, Mom. I love you too. Be careful, whatever this is." When the call ended, Penelope sat for a long while in the quiet of the guest suite, turning the locket over in her fingers, thinking about generations of women in her family who had carried a warning they never fully understood, protecting a legacy they couldn't name, simply because someone before them had insisted it mattered. It was, she thought, its own kind of quiet heroism, unglamorous and largely invisible, the sort that never made it into official histories but held the world together regardless. Nathaniel found her there an hour later, still sitting with the locket cradled in her palm. "How did it go?" he asked, settling beside her with a gentleness that had become, in the space of a single, overwhelming day, entirely natural to him. She didn't know anything, not really, just enough to be careful. "My great-grandmother passed down a warning without ever explaining what it was warning against. And somehow, over 3 generations, none of us questioned it enough to ask why." Penelope looked up at him. "That's its own kind of sad, isn't it? An entire family protecting a legacy none of us understood." "I would call it remarkable rather than sad," Nathaniel said. "Most secrets do not survive 3 generations intact, Penelope. Not without a considerably more coercive form of enforcement than a grandmother's careful instruction. Your family kept faith with a truth they could not see for 300 years. That is not a small thing." "I want her to meet you," Penelope said suddenly. "My mother, properly. Once things have settled down a little. Bed at I to time to 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 to. Something flickered across Nathaniel's face. An old, unfamiliar uncertainty that looked almost boyish on features carved by 4 centuries of absolute authority. "I have not been introduced to a mortal family as anything other than an employer in longer than I care to calculate." "Well," Penelope said, leaning into him, "there's a first time for everything, Croft. Even for 500-year-old kings." The security assessment Nathaniel had mentioned concluded 2 days later, resulting in a set of quiet, carefully unobtrusive changes to Penelope's daily life that she noticed only gradually. A driver now collected her each morning from the guest suite she had, somewhat to her own surprise, not yet left, ferrying her to the Historical Society's downtown offices in a car, considerably more armored than its understated exterior suggested. 2 members of Nathaniel's household staff, introduced simply as Marcus and Elena, began appearing at the edges of her workday with the kind of practiced, unobtrusive vigilance that made them almost, but not quite, easy to forget, were there at all. "I feel like I'm being guarded by very polite ninjas," Penelope told Nathaniel one evening, only half joking. "You are the sovereign of an entire coven who has, in the space of 2 months, dismantled one political rival's legal campaign and uncovered a 300-year-old conspiracy to murder your own ancestor," Nathaniel said, entirely unapologetic. "I would be failing you considerably if I left your safety to chance simply because the arrangement makes you feel watched." "I didn't say I minded," Penelope said. "I said It felt like ninjas. Marcus would be delighted to hear you think so. He has been attempting to cultivate an air of mystery for several decades now with, I regret to inform you, mixed success. Penelope laughed, and the sound of it, easy and unguarded, seemed to settle something in Nathaniel that she suspected had been tense for considerably longer than the 2 months she'd known him. Alaric visited the estate not long after, arriving unannounced one evening while Penelope was still at the Historical Society. And Nathaniel found his younger brother waiting for him in the study. A bottle of considerably old, considerably expensive scotch already open on the desk between them. "You didn't tell me," Alaric said without preamble, pouring 2 glasses and sliding one across the desk. "Any of it." "Not the plan, not the archivist, not the fact that you were apparently about to walk into my wedding and rewrite the entire political structure of 2 coasts. I did not know myself, Alaric, until roughly the moment it happened," Nathaniel said, accepting the glass. "I assure you the surprise was mutual. Camilla says she's remarkable." Alaric studied his brother over the rim of his own glass, something searching and unusually gentle in his expression for a creature who had spent most of his existence being somewhat overshadowed by his older brother's fearsome reputation. "She also says you've been different since the wedding, lighter. I didn't think that particular word applied to you anymore. If it ever did." "I did not think so either," Nathaniel admitted, swirling the scotch slowly, watching the amber liquid catch the firelight. "I had made my peace with it, Alaric. 5 centuries of careful isolation. I told myself it was simply the price of the crown, that attachment was a luxury a sovereign of my particular history could not reasonably afford. And now I find myself rearranging my entire schedule around the operating hours of a historical archive and delivering coffee personally and genuinely enjoying it." Nathaniel allowed himself a small, rare smile. "I am aware of how thoroughly this contradicts everything I have told you, and told myself, for the better part of 2 centuries. Alaric laughed, low and warm. "For what it's worth, brother, I have never once in my existence seen you look at anything the way you look at her. Not power, not territory, not even the crown itself on the day Father passed it to you." He grew more serious, leaning forward slightly. "You spent so many decades making sure I never had to carry the weight you carried, Nathaniel. Making sure I got to have this, a wife who loves me, a life that isn't just duty and calculation. I am glad, more than I know how to properly say, that you have finally allowed yourself the same thing." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, something unguarded moving behind his pale eyes. "Thank you, Alaric. That means more than you likely realize. Just don't wait 500 more years to admit it to her directly," Alaric said, raising his glass in a small, genuine toast. "Some of us would like to attend that wedding while we're still young enough to appreciate the open bar." "Careful," Nathaniel said dryly, though the warmth in his voice undercut any real threat. "I have not ruled out throwing you through another table. You'd have to catch me first," Alaric said, grinning, and for a moment the 2 brothers simply sat together in comfortable silence, the fire crackling low in the hearth. 4 centuries of careful, guarded distance between them finally, quietly closing. Later that night, long after the vows had been exchanged and the blood wine had been poured, and the last of the reception's guests had finally, reluctantly departed, Nathaniel led Penelope out onto the sprawling balcony overlooking the darkened, manicured gardens of Oheka Castle, having asked Lord DuPont's permission to remain a while longer after the other guests had gone. The cool night air was a welcome relief after the suffocating tension of the ballroom, carrying with it the faint scent of late blooming roses from the gardens below. $50 million, Nathaniel said softly, breaking the comfortable quiet between them, leaning against the stone balustrade and watching her with an intensity that made the cool air feel considerably warmer. That was our deal. The money will be wired to your historical society by morning. Exactly as promised. Penelope looked out over the sprawling estate. The same gardens she and Camilla had gazed over just a few hours earlier. Though everything about the view felt different now, weighted with everything that had happened since. Her life had completely and irrevocably changed. In the span of 6 hours, she possessed power, wealth, and influence she couldn't have fathomed the previous morning, sitting cross-legged on a library floor arguing about humidity control. She was, apparently, the sovereign of an entire coven of vampires she had not known existed 24 hours ago, and somewhere out there Victoria Vanderwood was almost certainly plotting some form of retaliation that Penelope suspected she had not yet begun to fully understand the shape of. But as she looked at Nathaniel, the moonlight catching the sharp, aristocratic lines of his jaw, softening for just this moment the centuries of careful control he wore like armor, she realized the money wasn't what mattered to her anymore. It hadn't been, if she was honest with herself, for at least the last hour. "I have a counteroffer," Penelope said, turning to face him fully. Nathaniel arched an eyebrow, intrigued, some of the weight of the evening's political maneuvering finally easing from his shoulders. "I'm listening." "Keep the 50 million, Penelope said, stepping closer to him, the magnetic pull between them undeniable now, heavy and electric in the quiet, dark. "Instead, I want full access to the restricted archives in your European estates. I want to catalogue the true history of your kind, properly, from primary sources, not the sanitized version Armand's family has apparently been telling for 3 centuries. I want to know who Isolde actually was, not the ghost story version. I want to understand what she was trying to warn you all about, before it cost her everything." "And?" Nathaniel prompted, his voice dropping to a soft, dangerous whisper as he closed the remaining distance between them, close enough now that Penelope had to tilt her head back slightly to hold his gaze. "And," Penelope breathed, looking up into his eyes, "I want a real date. No fake arrangements, no corporate deals, no 6-hour time limits and grant agreements. Just you and me, figuring out whatever this is, without an entire ballroom of vampires watching to see if I flinch." Nathaniel's gaze dropped to her lips, and something in his expression, some final wall he had maintained for 4 centuries, seemed to genuinely, finally give way. "I think, Miss Hayes," he murmured, wrapping a strong arm around her waist and pulling her flush against his chest, the cold of his skin no longer registering as anything but familiar now. "That is the best deal I have made in 1,000 years. When he kissed her, it was not the cold bite of a predator closing in on something helpless. It was the fierce, burning promise of a king who had finally, after 5 centuries of careful, deliberate isolation, found his queen standing in the wreckage of everything he'd assumed his life would always be. They stayed on that balcony far longer than either of them intended. The noise of the departing wedding staff and the distant, quiet sounds of the estate settling into night, fading into something entirely unimportant. When they finally made their way back down to the waiting car, the eastern sky was already beginning to lighten at the very edge of the horizon. a fact that seemed to genuinely trouble Nathaniel for the first time all night. "We should go," he said, glancing toward the faint gray line of approaching dawn, with an urgency that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with old, immutable biology. "I would prefer to discuss the coming weeks somewhere considerably more private than a moving vehicle at sunrise. The coming weeks? You are now. Whether either of us fully anticipated it 24 hours ago, the sovereign of an entire coven, Penelope. There will be council sessions, formal introductions to houses who did not attend tonight. Almost certainly an attempt by Victoria to contest the legitimacy of your claim through whatever legal or political channels remain available to her, which, given how thoroughly the blood seal confirmed your bloodline, will likely amount to very little beyond noise and inconvenience. And, of course, considerably more security than you are presently accustomed to, whether you find that comforting or suffocating." Penelope leaned back against the leather seat of the Rolls-Royce, letting out a long breath. The accumulated weight of the entire evening finally, fully catching up to her now that the adrenaline had begun to fade. "You know," she said, "when I signed up to be your fake date, I was mostly worried about awkward small talk and bad canapés." "In fairness," Nathaniel said, allowing himself a small, genuine smile as the car pulled away from the castle. The first pale light of dawn stretching across the Long Island countryside. The canapés were objectively excellent. "I checked personally, weeks ago, precisely because I anticipated the small talk would be considerably harder to manage." Penelope laughed, a real, unguarded sound that seemed to loosen something in her chest that had been wound tight since the moment Armand's crystal goblet shattered against the marble floor. "This is insane, Nathaniel. All of it. An hour ago I was being told an entire coven of vampires belongs to me because of a locket my mother made me swear never to sell. That's not a normal Tuesday." "No," Nathaniel agreed, reaching over to gently take her hand in his cold fingers threading through hers with a careful, deliberate tenderness that felt entirely at odds with the violence she'd watched him commit only hours earlier. "It is not, but I would ask you to consider, Penelope, that very little about my world has ever been normal, and that I have spent 5 centuries assuming that meant I was destined to face all of it entirely alone. Tonight was the first time in longer than I can properly calculate that I did not feel that particular weight quite so heavily." Penelope studied him for a long moment in the growing light. This ancient, terrifying, unexpectedly gentle creature who had walked into her library less than 2 days ago and upended the entire architecture of her life, without either of them fully understanding what they were setting in motion. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "I don't think you're facing any of it alone anymore either." The East and South were united that night, not by ancient blood magic or the cold calculations of political marriage, but by a woman who had refused, from the very first moment she looked up from a crumbling piece of parchment, to be a footnote in anyone's history, and by the immortal sovereign who found himself, after 500 years of careful isolation, completely and hopelessly captivated by her. But the peace that settled over the Croft estate in the days immediately following the wedding did not last uncontested, and both of them had known, even on that moonlit balcony, that it would not. Victoria Vanderwood did not wait long to make her move. Within 4 days of the wedding, formal legal challenges began arriving at Croft Holdings through a network of intermediaries clearly designed to obscure their true origin, though the pattern was unmistakable to anyone who had spent even a single evening watching Victoria operate. The challenges were, on their surface, procedural. Questions about the chain of custody for the manuscripts Penelope had translated. Accusations carefully worded to avoid direct legal exposure. That Croft Holdings had somehow manufactured or manipulated the blood seal evidence presented at the wedding, a formal request, submitted through a minor Southern noble, clearly acting as Victoria's proxy, for an independent council review of Penelope's claim to the Southern Covens. She's not even trying to hide that it's her, Penelope observed, reading through the third such filing over breakfast in Nathaniel's study. A room that had, in the space of a single week, become something close to her own second office. Doesn't that undermine the whole legal strategy? Victoria has never operated under the assumption that anyone would successfully oppose her, Nathaniel said, not looking up from his own correspondence. She is discovering, I suspect for the first time in several decades, what it feels like to lose. She is managing it poorly. Nathaniel handled the first wave of challenges with the same cold, methodical precision he applied to every threat against his court, dismantling each one through a combination of overwhelming documentary evidence and the quiet, unspoken reminder of exactly what had happened to the last person who raised a hand against Penelope in a room full of witnesses. But it was Penelope herself, 3 weeks into the campaign, who delivered the blow that finally, decisively ended Victoria's efforts entirely. Working late one evening in the restricted archive, Nathaniel had granted her full access to, exactly as promised in the counter-offer she'd made him on that first balcony. Penelope uncovered a second, previously unknown manuscript, tucked inside the binding of a larger 17th-century ledger, the kind of hidden document that only someone with her specific training in archival restoration would have thought to search for at all. It was a personal letter, written in Isolde's own hand, addressed to a Southern Coven elder. Penelope was eventually able to identify, through painstaking cross-referencing against genealogical records Armand himself provided, as a direct ancestor of Victoria Vanderwood's own house. The letter detailed, in devastating, precise detail, that same ancestor's role in orchestrating Isolde's execution, not out of any genuine belief that she posed a magical threat to the Covens, but out of a considerably more mundane motive entirely, a personal territorial rivalry that Isolde's proposed reforms would have directly undermined. It was, in essence, a 300-year-old confession. Preserved by Isolde herself, Penelope suspected as a form of insurance, a truth she clearly hoped someone, someday, might find and use. She knew, Penelope said quietly, staring at the fragile document under the archive's careful lighting, her voice thick with something between grief and awe. She knew they might come for her, and she left this specifically so someone could prove it later. She wasn't just documenting her research, Nathaniel. She was building a case for her own murder 300 years in advance. That, Nathaniel said, reading over her shoulder, sounds very much like a family trait. When Penelope presented the letter to the full council convened at Nathaniel's estate the following week, the effect was immediate and total. Victoria's legal challenges collapsed within days, not because of any procedural technicality, but because the revelation of her own ancestor's petty, self-serving role in Isolde's death made any further public campaign against Penelope's legitimacy not just legally untenable, but politically suicidal. Victoria Vanderwood did not appear at the final council session, where the matter was formally, permanently closed. She had, according to the quiet, careful gossip that reached Nathaniel's court in the weeks that followed, retreated to a private estate, somewhere in the Swiss Alps, her political ambitions in the East and South, both effectively, thoroughly ended. "You didn't need me at all in the end," Nathaniel observed one evening, watching Penelope work by lamplight in the archive, surrounded by the particular organized chaos of a scholar fully immersed in her element. "You dismantled Victoria's entire campaign with a single letter and roughly 11 hours of very patient archival work." "I had considerable help," Penelope said, not looking up from the fragile document she was carefully photographing for digital preservation. "Someone gave me a $50 million climate-controlled archive and full access to 4 centuries of restricted manuscripts. That tends to make the research portion considerably easier." "Even so," Nathaniel said, moving to stand behind her chair, resting his hands lightly on her shoulders, in a gesture that had become, over the preceding weeks, entirely familiar between them. "I have watched armies fail to accomplish in a decade what you managed in 3 weeks with nothing but patience and a very keen eye for hidden bindings. Isolde would have liked that, I think," Penelope said quietly. "Being taken down by research instead of violence. For once, instead of the other way around." Armand Dupont, true to his word, met with Penelope regularly throughout those weeks. The two of them, slowly, carefully building something that started as formal political necessity and gradually deepened into a genuine, if unusual, friendship. He walked her through generations of Southern Coven history with a patience that surprised her, given how thoroughly his own understanding of his family's legacy had been upended, and on more than one occasion he arrived at their meetings carrying old letters or ledgers his own household had kept sealed for centuries, offered freely now as a kind of ongoing penance for a wrong his ancestors had committed long before he'd ever taken his own oath of leadership. "I did not know her personally, of course," Armand admitted during one such meeting, turning a fragile, centuries-old letter over carefully in his hands before passing it to Penelope. "I was newly turned myself when it happened, barely more than a fledgling with no real voice in council matters. But I remember, even then, that something about the official account never sat entirely comfortably with me. I simply lacked the courage, for 300 years, to ask the questions that might have unraveled it." "You're asking them now," Penelope said gently. "I am trying," Armand said, "though I suspect 3 centuries of silence cannot be undone quite so quickly as it was maintained. It is a slower process than I anticipated, Lady Hayes. Guilt, I have found, does not resolve itself simply because the truth has finally surfaced." "No," Penelope agreed. "It usually doesn't. But it's a start." Camilla, newly returned from a honeymoon spent somewhere Penelope suspected was considerably more exotic than the manuscripts occupying her own days, became a regular visitor to the archive as well, arriving with the particular restless energy of a newly married woman still adjusting to a change in her life, and eager for conversation that didn't revolve entirely around Coven politics. "You've turned the most feared king on the eastern seaboard into someone who reorganizes his entire schedule around your research hours," Camilla observed one afternoon, perched on the edge of Penelope's work table, watching Nathaniel personally deliver a fresh pot of coffee, an act Penelope suspected he had never once performed for another living soul in 4 centuries of existence. I want you to understand how genuinely unprecedented that is. I have known him my entire immortal life. He does not fetch things. He likes bringing coffee," Penelope said, accepting the cup from Nathaniel with a smile that made Camilla's eyebrows climb even higher. "He likes you," Camilla corrected, grinning. "The coffee is simply the closest approximation of romance. A 500-year-old vampire could reasonably improvise on short notice, given that flowers wilt, and he has apparently decided jewelry would feel too much like another business transaction." Nathaniel, from across the room, did not deny it. It was nearly 2 months after the wedding, on an evening when the archive was quiet and the last of the day's translation work had been carefully set aside for the night, that Nathaniel found Penelope standing at the tall arched window overlooking the estate's gardens, the same restless, contemplative posture she'd carried onto Camilla's terrace that first chaotic night at Oheka Castle. "You're thinking about her again," Nathaniel said, joining her at the window. "Isolde, I keep wondering what she would think of all this," Penelope admitted. Whether she'd be proud that her bloodline finally got its due, or furious that it took 300 years and a wedding disaster to make it happen. "Perhaps both," Nathaniel said. "I did not know her, but I have read enough of her own words now in your translations to suspect she was not a woman inclined towards simple feelings about anything." Penelope laughed softly, leaning into him slightly. "That tracks. I inherited that particular trait, apparently. Among others," Nathaniel said, and something in his voice carried a warmth that had, over the preceding weeks, become as familiar to her as her own name. "I have spent considerable time recently attempting to identify precisely what it was in the corporate library that first genuinely disarmed me. Beyond the obvious immunity to my glamour, I believe I have finally settled on an answer." "Do tell." "You looked at me," Nathaniel said. "An immortal king capable of leveling a city block without particular effort. And your primary concern was humidity damage to a first edition Machiavelli. I do not believe anyone has looked at me with quite that specific combination of irreverence and genuine passion in longer than I can properly calculate." "In my defense," Penelope said, "the humidity damage was a legitimate concern." "I have no doubt," Nathaniel said, and kissed her, unhurried and certain, in a way that felt entirely different from the desperate, charged urgency of that first night on Camilla's terrace. Something settled now, something that had chosen, deliberately, to stay. In the months that followed, the immortal world learned to speak Penelope Hayes's name with considerably more care than they had spoken it. That first chaotic evening at Oheka Castle. The Southern Covens, once ruled through Armand's careful, aristocratic diplomacy, found themselves guided instead by something closer to genuine accountability, formal accords modeled directly on the reforms Isolde had proposed and died for 3 centuries earlier, finally belatedly enacted by her own direct descendant. Seraphine's house, and several others who had quietly remembered Isolde's true story despite generations of official erasure, became some of Penelope's most steadfast allies within the council. Grateful, in ways they did not always have the words to express, that the old wrong had finally been named. Penelope's mother, true to the promise made over that first, unsteady phone call, was eventually brought to the estate under careful, deliberate circumstances. A weekend visit framed to her as simply meeting her daughter's new partner, a wealthy businessman whose family had a complicated old money history. Nathaniel, to Penelope's quiet delight, was visibly, uncharacteristically nervous in the hours before her mother's arrival, rearranging the same 3 items on the drawing-room mantel, no fewer than 4 times before Penelope finally took his hand and told him, gently, that her mother was going to like him regardless of how the candlesticks were arranged. She did. Linda Hayes spent the better part of the visit alternating between quiet awe at the estate itself and the particular, searching scrutiny of a mother evaluating whether the man courting her daughter was worthy of the trust being placed in him. And by the time she departed 2 days later, she had extracted from Nathaniel a promise, made with surprising sincerity for a 500-year-old sovereign, that he would take considerably better care of the locket's remaining history than the last several centuries of covens had managed. "She likes you," Penelope told him after the car had pulled away down the long gravel drive. "She threatened me twice," Nathaniel said, sounding faintly bewildered. "Once regarding your happiness, and once, somewhat more alarmingly, regarding the proper storage conditions for family heirlooms. That's how you know she likes you," Penelope said, laughing. "If she didn't care, she wouldn't have bothered with the threats." She also asked, quite directly, whether my intentions toward you were serious. Nathaniel added, still visibly recovering from the encounter, "I have negotiated treaties with covens who have existed for 1,000 years, Penelope. I have stared down armies without so much as raising my pulse. Your mother, over a plate of scones, very nearly undid me." "Welcome to the family," Penelope said, grinning. "It only gets more terrifying from here. Wait until Thanksgiving. I begin to suspect," Nathaniel said with the particular dry gravity of a man only half joking, "that I underestimated precisely what I was agreeing to on that first balcony. Too late to back out now, Croft. I would not dream of it," he said, and meant it entirely, and in a quiet, climate-controlled archive deep beneath the Croft estate in the Hudson Valley, surrounded by manuscripts far older and far stranger than anything Christie's auction house had ever put up for sale. Penelope Hayes continued the work she had unknowingly been destined for her entire life, uncovering, one careful translation at a time, the true story of the woman whose blood ran through her own veins and whose sacrifice, 3 centuries buried and nearly erased, had finally, impossibly, found its way home. She kept a small, framed copy of Isolde's final letter on the wall above her work table, not the original, which remained carefully preserved under archival glass, but a copy she'd made herself, in her own hand, the first week after the council session that finally cleared her ancestor's name. It felt, she told Nathaniel once, like keeping a promise to someone who had waited 300 years for anyone to finally understand what she'd been trying to protect. Nathaniel, for his part, found himself doing something he had not permitted himself to do in longer than he could accurately calculate. He began, slowly and with the particular caution of a man relearning a skill he'd deliberately let atrophy, to hope, not simply for the continued stability of his court or the successful integration of the Southern Covens, though both mattered to him more than he would have readily admitted before that wedding. He hoped, quietly, and with a fierce, guarded tenderness he had not felt since long before Penelope Hayes was ever born, for a future that included her, unambiguously and without qualification, for as long as she was willing to have it. On the evening of what would have marked exactly 1 year since that first chaotic night at Oheka Castle, Nathaniel returned to the same corporate library where it had all begun, the same shelves of first editions and fragile manuscripts, the same functioning radiator Penelope had once threatened to staple someone to a ceiling over. He found her exactly where he had found her that very first evening, cross-legged on the floor, a mechanical pencil holding her hair in place, entirely absorbed in a fragile piece of parchment. "You're doing this on purpose," Penelope said, without looking up, a small smile already tugging at her mouth. "The anniversary thing? The library. This is very deliberately sentimental of you, Croft. I have been informed, repeatedly, that I am capable of sentimentality when properly motivated," Nathaniel said, stepping fully into the room, moving with the same silent, predatory grace that had first announced his presence a year earlier. "I thought it fitting to return to where the entire arrangement began." Penelope set down the parchment carefully and rose to meet him, and something in his expression, some rare and total openness she had learned over the preceding year to treasure precisely because it was so hard-won, made her breath catch the way it had that very first night in the tuxedo, in the ballroom, on the balcony. "So," she said, "what's the deal this time?" Nathaniel reached into his jacket and produced, not a folder of legal paperwork this time, but a small velvet box, worn slightly at the corners, in a way that suggested he had carried it, uncertainly, for longer than he was willing to admit. "No time limit," he said quietly. "No fine print. Simply you and me, and whatever remains of forever." Penelope looked at the box, then up at him, at this ancient, terrifying, unexpectedly gentle king who had walked into her library exactly 1 year ago and rewritten the entire architecture of her life without either of them fully understanding that first chaotic evening precisely what they were setting in motion. "I think, Mr. Croft," she said, echoing words spoken on a moonlit balcony a year earlier, "that might be the best deal you've ever offered me. Power, ancient secrets, and undeniable chemistry. What started as a fake date turned into a royal bloodline revelation that shook the immortal world to its core. If you loved this thrilling tale of romance, hidden history, and a fiercely intelligent heroine bringing a vampire king to his knees, hit that like button. Share this story with your friends who love dark fantasy. And don't forget to subscribe for more gripping original stories every single week.